The title of the series is Ploughing the Clouds, which is a phrase I got somewhere from Irish folklore. Now I no longer remember where. And I believe it was a sort of metaphor for an impossibility or a futility. In other words, it's as hopeless as ploughing the clouds. So that describes my work in theory and in practice. But I think it also has another meaning. It has another meaning to me, and that is you can plow the clouds. You can shape the luminous and ephemeral stuff of the imagination. You can shape the air. There's such a thing as air art, like fire art and earth art and water art. And this then is an exercise in air art, in the airiness of theory. Everything that I say is pure hypothesis and purely subjective. I'm saying this because there are real anthropologists in the audience, and I don't want to be embarrassingly put into the position of defending categorical statements which I don't even believe in, but I'm simply throwing around in an experimental fashion to see if any sparks shoot out of those clouds. So another aspect of this work is a sort of at a slant. I believe that I'm doing something for Ethnopoetics Week with these lectures. By the last lecture, I hope to get around to the origins of poetry, but that's going to take a long time, and I may never get there. But again, everything that we are going to talk about, it seems to me, is strongly relevant to the subject of poetics and ethnopoetics, if not in a direct sense, then in the sense of what Ed Sanders calls investigative poetics. In other words, I feel that if you're just writing poetry out of your own pure subjectivity, unless you're Dylan Thomas, it doesn't take you very far. To continue the Celtic comparisons, it would be better if you were a sort of a Yeats, someone who actually studied something, be it, in his case, alchemy or Celtic folklore, or, in this case, anthropology and archaeology and what's come to be known as ethnohistory and various other neologisms of dubious value. I think, that poetry wants to get its hands into something. It wants to dig in the earth, and and that may even be more than just a metaphor. Archaeology and related studies, I think, are extremely poetically exciting. And in my second lecture, I'll tell you about my own experiences last summer in Wisconsin, which I hope to continue this summer in August, where I got my hands in the dirt for the first time. It was always book fantasies for me, but last summer I got into a little amateur archaeology and trespassing, and being chased by various Gothic six-toed farmers around the cow pastures of Wisconsin, trying to see various mounds and petroglyphs and what have you. And I was in a constant state of ecstasy the whole time. I can't tell you the tiny little discoveries, things that we discovered that were not in any written source, it was like pure flashes of LSD, right straight to the cerebellum. And when I try to imagine what the excitement involved in making a major discovery in archaeology, like the tomb of Alexander's father, or the gold hoard of the Achaemenid dynasty, or some Mayan pyramid that no one ever noticed before, of which I gather there are many. I don't think I could stand it. I think I'd expire on the spot. So I strongly recommend every poet to get a sideline in something like this. And really, I'm just offering this as an example of the way in which once you get your hands in the dirt, once you read a few books, once you've looked at a few pictures and studied a few carbon datings and so forth and so on, you have as much right to your crackpot theory as any archaeologist or anthropologist has to theirs. Generally speaking, archaeology is a science which is terrified of interpretation. Anthropology is much less guilty in this respect, but archaeology has the idea of itself as a science, and of course it isn't. It's an art, and with scientific aspects, just like any art. And so, but there's a kind of paranoid defensiveness on the part of archaeology as an academic and professional science, in which the wild interpretations that were given in the 19th century, which pretty much all proved to be wrong about the past, and especially about prehistory, have been such a traumatic experience for archaeology that archaeologists nowadays refuse to interpret. You know, they'll tell you we found 3 arrowheads, 7 bones, and they were in such and such a relationship, and that's all. You know, and only the most daring or the ones with tenure are the ones who dare to interpret, who dare to actually try to imagine what the life of prehistory could have been like. Prehistory, of course, is already a loaded term. It implies that somehow we've evolved from a prehistorical state when everything was inchoate and incomprehensible and nasty and brutish and short, to a superior state of civilized awareness in which time unfolds for us in a measured and orderly way, and in which everything becomes known or will become known. There's an amnesiac gulf that these kind of attitudes open up between the present and the past, which is not so alien, which is, after all, just the past of human beings, of our ancestors. There haven't been even more than a few hundred generations since the Paleolithic. I mean, it's really a fly speck of time in the eyes of the gods. And it's not so hard to understand, in my opinion, a great deal of what was going on in prehistory. Of course, I say that as a crackpot, you know, not as an academic. In approaching archaeology, therefore, I believe in something which transcends what they now call interdisciplinarianism, which means that communications are cautiously open between college departments. I would like to see something that might perhaps be called anti-categorizationism take the place of this interdisciplinary timidity. I would like to see all the barriers between these disciplines broken down, or at least breached. I'd like to see what the Russian critic Bakhtin called permeable boundaries, divisions which are kept up for the purposes of discourse and of rational discourse, but which are always known to be permeable, so that not only anthropology can be allowed to seep into archaeology, and ethnography into ethnohistory, and history into ethnography, and all the various schools of history can be their findings and methodologies applied to archaeology and all the other so-called social sciences. This, I don't think, is going to happen in the academic world, or not very soon. I think and therefore, I do truly believe, even in the moment when I try to overcome my hostility to the whole idea of academic discipline, that we amateurs, we outsiders, do have some role to play, even if it's only as annoying gadflies. The English writer John Michel, who is certainly not a professional archaeologist, has made great contributions, I think, just by being open to everything. Astroarchaeology and ley lines and any kind of madness, as long as you keep a kind of agnostic approach to this and don't become a true believer in any of these crackpot theories, but are able to drift creatively from theory to theory, then I think that the enthusiastic amateur or obsessive amateur has a real creative role to play in forcing various academic fortresses to open a little crack in the portcullis somewhere and let in some various breaths of fresh air from other disciplines. After all, it's all just humanity, you know. It's all just us, and there's no reason for these amazingly ridiculous borders which are erected, walls, fortresses, fences. Fences might make good neighbors, but I don't think it makes for good humanitarianism. And in fact, Robert Frost was a well-known son of a bitch. So I'm going to deal with subjects which are pretty much taboo since the 19th century, like the question of origins, for example. Origins are something that no one wants to talk about anymore. All the origin theories, the origin of language, the origin of art, the origin of consciousness, the origin of the Indo-European people, or the origin of the megaliths. Where did these things or these peoples come from? What was their origin? In the 19th century, when these questions were asked, origins were seen as categorical imperatives, which would exclude other origins. In other words, once you had decided, for example, that Hebrew was the origin of all languages, because God obviously spoke Hebrew, then you could take a wild child, you know, an enfant sauvage who had been brought up by wolves in the wild, and lock him or her into a room and record all the sounds that the child made, and say that this, of course, these are all Hebrew roots, and therefore the origin of language is a divine origin, and that's that. Categorically, that's that. I would like to return to the whole question of origins, which has again been dumped out of a kind of paranoia or a disappointment in the failure of these theories to turn up hard scientific data. But instead of viewing origins as categorical imperatives, or in other words, absolutes, distinct places along a line of linear thinking, I would like to construct a palimpsest of origins. Now, a palimpsest, if you don't know, is a word for an old kind of manuscript where, when paper was expensive, people used to write one way across the paper, and then they'd turn the paper and write another way across the writing, and then they'd turn the paper over and do it on the other side. And sometimes there's even more than two scripts on the same piece of paper. So my palimpsest is I see it written on animation gels, on actual transparent sheaves of paper, and I would like to take all these theories that interest me, all these stories about origins, and pile them up like a stack of animation gels, and then I'd like to hold them up to the sunlight and see where the light comes through all those blobs of black. And this is a kind of Kabbalistic approach, because the ancient Jewish, the old Jewish Kabbalists used to say that the spaces between the letters were as significant, or perhaps even more significant, than the letters themselves, because that's where the divine illumination was coming through. So without making any categorical statements about, without giving any origin theory a priority, without making any dogmatic statements about origins, or developments, I just like to keep adding one theory to another, and hope at the end that as we drift around, the French philosopher Lyotard has used the term drift work to describe his kind of philosophy, and I also find this term very congenial. As we drift from theory to theory, maybe at least for a moment, some illuminations will come through. The study of origins in this way becomes simply another epistemology, simply another way of knowing things. And that knowing in itself is not an absolute. That knowing, the knowing also drifts from point to point, from like a wave, actually, rather than like a point. And of all the origins that we're interested in, of course, it's the origin of consciousness which is the most fascinating. You know, in other words, when does the animal become the human? When is it no longer instinct, if that's what animal thought is, and of course that's a deep question in itself, and become self-consciousness, not even reason, but simply awareness of self, as separate from all that other. And some prominent answers to that question would be, in other words, the origin of this, what is the origin of this consciousness? What is the origin of this self-consciousness? Some people would say, for example, it's fear of death. That once the human brain gets big enough, it begins to project thought into the future. It no longer lives for the moment. And as soon as that thought is projected, or even perception is projected, a moment into the future, then it is possible to become aware of one's own death. And having become aware of one's own death, and the obvious inevitability of it, and the obvious meaninglessness of it, or let's say the impossibility of its meaning, then such thinkers of this school would say that from that moment on, self-consciousness exists, and therefore culture exists, and therefore civilization exists, and therefore the whole ball of wax. But you could also, instead of taking this death view, which by the way is somewhat related to Freudian thinking, although not precisely, you could also take another leaf from Freud, or from the Freudians in general, and talk about sexuality as the origin of consciousness. That once a sexuality is separated from instinctual behavior, whatever the hell that might be, and you know, actually I was looking at, there was a PBS special on the love life of the animals, you know, sort of animal porn, you know, from PBS animal porn. And the variety of, you know, the absolute stunning variety of ways of making love that exist in the animal world certainly puts a very big question mark next to the whole idea of instinct. But anyway, let's assume that the beasts have instinct and the humans have something more, and that something more is desire, which again is a projection into the future. Even when the beloved object or the desired object is absent, one desires the object, the person, the thing, whatever it might be. So that passion or sexuality or desire then becomes the spark that brings consciousness into being. Another theory which I like a lot, the chief proponent of which at the moment is Terrence McKenna, is that consciousness arose because of the ingestion of psychedelic plants. That and this sounds funny, you know, but the more I think about it, the more I realize it's certainly a theory that deserves to be layered into that palimpsest along with the other theories. To look on it as exclusively true, the way Terrence does, I think gets you into various kinds of conceptual difficulties. But to look on it as also true, along with other theories, that makes it to me very, very interesting. That suddenly restores its interest as a theory. So you can imagine that an early hominid, some Australopithecine or Peking man or woman, or Java man or woman, or Homo habilis, or one of these very, very pre-human humans, if you can think of them that way, in browsing over various plants, not knowing whether it's good or bad, so, you know, accidentally ingests some psilocybin or Amanita muscaria or fly agaric or ergot or some other naturally occurring psychotropic. And of course, in the New World, there are hundreds of such plants. The Old World, in some ways, seems strangely poor in psychotropic plants, but it's certainly not lacking in them. And another point about psychotropic plants is that some of them are only activated by a process. They have to be processed in some way. Like ayahuasca, for example, has to have other plants added to it before it becomes a viable psychotropic. So that in any case, I think Terrence's image is that a kickstart was needed for the human condition, that something needed, these hominids needed a boot in the ass to set them on the way of being human, whatever that was going to be, and that some mushroom supplied this kick. Then there's then there's a theory which I'd like to bring in tangentially, which is the theory of Georges Bataille, B-A-T-A-I-L-L-E, who in his book Theory of Religion, and also to a certain extent in The Accursed Share, discusses the question of the origins of consciousness and of sexuality and so forth. And he speaks of a hypothetical original order of intimacy, is what he calls it. In other words, hypothetically for him, at the beginning of human consciousness, there is no separation. There is somehow consciousness without separation, so that the human condition has already been reached, but there is no self-awareness in the sense of self-alienation. There's no potential psychotic split or abyss that has yet opened up within human consciousness. And this is the stage that's referred to in every body of myth or folklore as the time when the gods walked the earth, when the animals spoke like humans, when all the orders of existence were on a single horizontal plane and in direct communication and, as you might say, ecological relation with each other. And I think Bataille's weak point is that he's unable to describe or explain why this order of intimacy should be broken. What would induce the doubling of consciousness in a situation like this? This surely would be perfection. This would be like a permanent psychedelic state, in which one was always acting on the basis of of what we might call a transcendent consciousness, which is also immanent at the same time and involved in things, involved in the world, in nature. So what is it that causes then what Bataille calls the violence of the sacred? Presumably under the order of intimacy, there is in fact no consciousness of the sacred, just as in Bali there's no word for art. But everyone, the artist is not a special kind of person, but every person is a special kind of artist. So also projecting backwards into the Paleolithic, or to the origins of humanity, wherever they may be or whenever they may be, there's also this also pertains. So, what possible shock or catastrophe could have occurred to break that original order of intimacy and make future generations view it as a hideous chaos instead of as the golden age? That's the question, or that and many other questions about breaks and abysses and separations is the question that I'm proposing. And I'm not proposing to answer it with any one single simple-minded answer. But I want to create a complex web of references to various theories about this moment, this tragic, catastrophic moment, which may, of course, have been extended over centuries or even millennia of time, but which appears to us in retrospect, obviously, as a moment, a crack, out of which time and space, as two different things, emerge. This also leads directly to the whole question of art and writing. In the hypothetical original order of intimacy, when the animals spoke to man and the gods walked on the earth, what would have been the point of art or writing? Obviously, there would be no point. Just as all consciousness would be a kind of perpetual psychedelic trip or high, so also all art would be life itself. It would be totally indistinguishable. Not only would there be no word for it, there presumably would even be no words as yet at all. But at some point in the development of the human, techne, the Greek word for technology, techne comes into being. And techne obviously represents the interface between my consciousness and that world out there. Now my consciousness is going to manipulate that world. It has taken that world for the object and no longer the subject of its thought. Formerly, as Levi Strauss says, you know, animals and plants are good things to think with. They're actually processual. They're part of a process of thinking. So if you look at ancient myth, or if you look at the paintings on the caves of the paintings on the walls of the Paleolithic caves, you see a process of thinking with the things of nature. In other words, nature is still the subject of the thought to a large extent. Afterwards, as art and as language come into being, the split between the medium, the in-between stage of techne comes into being. Now there's something that's in between me when I grasp reality. Something interposes between me and that reality. It is no longer part of me, it's a part of some other. So out of this, of course, obviously this is the origin of art. At this point, one wishes not only to manipulate the world, but to create beauty in the world, because before everything was beauty, so there was no concept of beauty. Now there's something which is unbeautiful. It's inside. It's the psychoid split which has occurred, this alienation of self from self, and therefore something needs to be rectified. So a balance needs to be restored. So art comes into being, ritual comes into being, the whole order of the sacred, which includes art, now comes into being. And this is the point at which we get to, let's say, to Neanderthal man. 40,000 to 60 to 40,000 BC, flourished before the last ice age. They're still arguing as to whether Neanderthal was Homo sapiens, or wise man, as we like to call ourselves, or whether Neanderthal was some lost branch of evolution that didn't make it, or whether, in fact, it was an evolutionary precursor to Homo sapiens, or what. It's still a mystery. Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do. This is an interesting point that I talked about last year. And if we're going to talk about evolution, then we're going to have to ask why these primitive creatures had actually bigger brains. What did they need those extra brains for? Very curious. My own poetic fancy is that they needed bigger brains because their perceptual world was so much bigger than ours. That they were still closer to this order of intimacy, and therefore the myriad things, the 10,000 things, as the Chinese say, were much more perceivable, much more perceived by them. And if you, for example, if you visit a South American tribe, now you'll find that you walk through a jungle with them. I mean, I haven't done this myself, but I've read wonderful descriptions of it. You walk through a jungle, and they see everything. The forest is a book for them. It's a text. They know what everything is. They call forth everything. They evoke everything. They live with everything. And you're seeing what? You know, a hellish green chaos of perception, out of which nothing appears to you as meaningful. So, assuming that old Neanderthal was closer to that world in a way which even our modern tribal people can no longer be, there were many more things that Neanderthal had to think with. And this is a strange way of looking at things, because we feel that civilization, of course, has created the many things. And before that, there was only a kind of brutal simplicity. You know, what John Michel calls the Ur-Dummheit theory of humanity, that human beings were originally stupid and only recently became clever. You know, which is a very unsatisfactory theory to me, because well, you know, this has to be said, it's as stupid as it may sound, because this is still, to a large extent, orthodoxy within the archaeological world. When I see the burial sites, for example, of the Neanderthal, which is just about all we can recover of their culture, I don't feel this brutal stupidity. I feel something very profound. There's a wonderful dig in Iraq that I've read about called the Cave of the Flowers, which is a Neanderthal burial where a pollen analysis was made of the dust in the graves. I forget the name of the woman who did this. It was a brilliant thing. And it was discovered that the burials had been made with heaps and heaps of flowers and herbs had been piled into the grave on top of the bodies or underneath the bodies. And that some of these plants, she was able to identify them all, and many of them turned out to be plants which are still used in Iraq, in that region today, as medicinal or magical plants. So here's a cultural continuity going back to, 40,000 BC, which speaks directly to us, because I've actually lived in that part of the world and used those herbal remedies. So that was a direct contact between me and the brilliance of Neanderthals. The use of red ochre in graves already begins with Neanderthal and continues right up to the present. Ochre is perhaps the original religious symbol. Red earth was put into the graves, perhaps to symbolize blood, as the blood is the life, perhaps to symbolize light, as in the red sunlight, but obviously having a whole complex of lifelike symbolism connected with it, and indicating, some people would say, indicating already a belief in immortality, or a belief in the continuance of some kind of life beyond the grave. So religion, in toto, the whole ball game, already there, long before Cro-Magnon, long before modern man. As a matter of fact, just as a footnote, somebody, I guess it was Andrew, was talking at the panel yesterday about writing, and he dated it as beginning, as we've all been taught to see writing as having begun in the late Neolithic in Mesopotamia, which is already very, very late in the story of prehistory. In fact, it's the end of the story, because once writing comes along and succeeds, then history begins. But first of all, the scholar Marija Gimbutas, who's a wonderful archaeologist, and I'll be referring to her work a lot, has already discovered that the early Neolithic, 7th millennium, in the Balkan, northern Greek and Balkan and western Anatolian regions, that these societies which she describes, very, very early Neolithic, far, far, far earlier than Mesopotamia or Egypt, already had developed some kind of a symbological system. Of course, we can't decipher it at all, although she made some very, very interesting stabs at doing so. But her arguments basically lead to the conclusion that writing itself is far, far older than we believe, and in fact is prehistoric. And then Alexander Marshak, another great archaeologist with a real vivid imagination, traces notation, at least, if not writing, way back into the Stone Age, even into the Paleolithic, on a number of objects which he has studied, which had never been studied before because they were so embarrassing and impossible to understand. They're objects which have scratches on them, and they're obviously not decorative. I mean, they're not at all interesting to look at. Some of them are very worn, as if they'd been carried around in somebody's pocket or used over a long period of time, and they have little nicks or scratches or marks in them. And no one had ever asked what these things meant until Marshak came along and suddenly saw them as a form of notation. Because, of course, according to the Ur-Dummheit theory, these people were too stupid to do something like that. So therefore, ergo, these things were meaningless or perhaps decorative, but basically meaningless. Marshak asked if they might not be notative, and he started counting the scratch marks and adding them up and seeing where they were divided. And over and over and over again, he began finding numbers which related to the lunar cycle. 30s, 28s, numbers like that. And 7s, 28s, numbers like that. And so he hypothesized and wrote a great deal and extremely, painstakingly careful work to propose his theory that that these were in fact the origins of calendrical mathematics. and that for reasons unknown but perhaps understandable or recoverable through ethnography, that these Paleolithic hunters were already interested in the calendar, which was previously thought to be a Neolithic invention, dependent upon agriculture, or perhaps giving rise to agriculture, and having nothing to do with hunting, with the hunting societies. So every origin can be pushed back. That's the only point I'm trying to make here. All the origins can be pushed back, pushed back, pushed back. And you begin with, as I did, with a fascination with early classical societies like Greece and Mesopotamia, and then you start going back. Under every fact, a trapdoor opens and drops you down into an archaeology of time, and you discover that all those layers are still present. None of this has vanished, and I'm not talking just about archaeological stratigraphy, although that's part of it. Within every consciousness there is and remains a hunter-gatherer consciousness, or a peasant, Neolithic peasant consciousness. We are all still those people. It's only been just the merest briefest time since we were not those people, and in fact, secretly we are still those people. We have links, strong links of consciousness which connect us to those people and which have been denied, vigorously, hysterically, rigidly denied ever since the rise of civilization. Ever since the rise of civilization in the Fertile Crescent, or whatever you want to call it. Actually, it was northern Anatolia. Well, I'll get to that later. As soon as we have a mythology to look at, it's a mythology of denial of this connection. It's a mythology which tells us that those ancient people were chaotic and evil and bad, and that we, the agriculturalists with the priests and the kings and the storehouses full of grain, we're the good guys. And those primitive tribes people, those are the bad guys. Those are the avatars of chaos, and we are the avatars of order. And so history itself is founded on a total dualism, on this dichotomy, on a split which was perceived to have taken place in time between a primitive chaos, and this theory, as I say, has been identified with the line that the life of primitive man is nasty, brutish, and short, as who was it? Locke? Hobbes said. So this has been the point of view ever since Mesopotamia rose itself from the slime of prehistory. And it remains the ideology of today, obviously. Otherwise, we as a culture would not still be engaged in desperately trying to wipe out every last vestige of the Paleolithic on one level. I mean, we heard all the eek stories from the panel the other day about how this language is disappearing and that tribe is disappearing, and this is not a joke. This is happening. On the other hand, we right now are living through what I would call a return of the Paleolithic, and I'll get to that later. But by that I mean that nothing disappears, and finally now, after all these centuries, certain weights have been lifted from our consciousness. Civilization itself has failed so miserably, in certain respects anyway, that we have regained our vision of this prehistoric past, and we've reinterpreted it. Now we have a new interpretation of it, and that's why we have neo-shamanism and neo-paganism and green philosophies and Gaian philosophies and ecological activism, and all those kinds of forces in modern society are coming out of what I call not a return to the Paleolithic. No one wants to bomb themselves back to the Stone Age, but a return of the Paleolithic. And I hope to return to that. So anyway, these dichotomies are set up: order and chaos, cultivated and wild. St. George and the Dragon, that's a good example, which can be traced back to one of the very earliest Babylonian myths of Tiamat and Marduk. Tiamat was the dragon, or rather the dragoness. She was the Earth Mother. Her progeny were monsters, and she had to be removed from heaven by Marduk, who was the male, phallic, patriarchal god, by contrast anyway, the warrior, priest, king god, who slaughters the female Tiamat, who's symbolic of water and chaos and shapelessness, and cuts her up into little pieces, and out of those pieces human beings are created. And so human beings are the carrion, gobbets of carrion from the dead body of the matriarchal dragon. And human beings are created for one purpose and one purpose only by this act of Marduk, and that is to work for the priests and kings, to fill up the temples with grain so that there will be wealth for the priests and kings. It says so. Go read it in the book. I'm not making this up. That's what the myth says. And I take it quite literally. St. George has pinned down dragons all over Europe. If you go travel around Europe from church to church, wherever there's a church dedicated to St. George, there's a dragon underneath with a lance through it, sticking it into the earth, where St. George pinned it down. And in this way, the Marduk consciousness, St. George is definitely Marduk, the Marduk consciousness, by pinning down these dragons, actually creates the landscape of culture. Before there was only chaos, only wilderness, only forest, only what the Cuban magicians call el monte, the forest and mountain combined into one concept, the wildness, the out there, which is not us. By slaying the representative of that otherness, which is a dragon or a snake, and pinning it down, St. George actually creates the landscape of Europe. This is called landnama in some Scandinavian language, I think Swedish, I'm not sure, Danish? Icelandic, thank you. This is the actual emergence of cultured landscape out of nothingness, out of supposed chaos. Now, of course, as I said before, it's not chaos for the tribal hunter who lives inside it. The forest, the rainforest, is not chaos to the Mbuti pygmies. It's their home, it's their text, it's their everything. They have no concept of a cultivated space separated from this forest. No concept of an other place or an other time. They're still, as it were, not only living in dream time, but in dream space. But for the modern consciousness, which begins already with Babylon, just like the Bible implies, for modern consciousness, which begins with these great Mesopotamian civilizations, is a process precisely of created. They look on it as actually creating the earth. This is why, if you read the mythologies of these people, this is a process of creation. Marduk creates human beings. Before that, there were no human beings. There were only wild monsters who inhabited the forests. And in Gilgamesh, the character of Enkidu, who comes down, this is the first epic of the human race. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. Gilgamesh, who's the great king, the Marduk figure in the tale, his best friend is Enkidu, who comes from the mountains, in other words, from El Monte, from the forest, from the wild place. And he is an hairy man, as the Bible says of some character or another. He's a hairy fella. He's a sort of a Sasquatch character. And he comes down out of the mountains because Gilgamesh tempts him with a woman. Desire tempts him to become civilized. And then he and Gilgamesh fight a terrible battle, and afterwards they become the best of friends. So there's eventually, of course, no culture could survive forever with this schizophrenic split going on all the time, this intense, rigid consciousness of fences and fencing off of space. I mean, it would just be too psychotic. So there's always a reconciliation that occurs. First a split into two, first a separation, a thesis and antithesis, if you like, and then, using Hegelian terminology, a synthesis, or as I would prefer to say, a dialectical reconciliation between these terms. And so the wild is absorbed into the civilized, and the power of the wild is used and understood. Sometimes it involves a contract or a contact with the remnants of the wild people who live out in the woods. Sometimes their magic is more powerful than our magic. And if we civilized ones want to, be cured of some dread disease or put a spell on our wife, then we go to the old sorceress of the forest, you know, the witch who lives on the other side of the clearing. If you read fairy tales about witches, they're always on the other side of the clearing. So the remnants of the wild people remain necessary. Actually, once the last indigenous tribe is erased from this earth, if that's going to happen, that will be the millennium. That will be the end. Because without that existent consciousness of the wild, then the existent consciousness of cultivation and of culture will die. It will lose its root. And even if this root is surrounded by images of violence, it is still it's still legitimately there. So we're looking at a gradual process of separation. I don't believe that we can take one moment in time and say, "Ooh, that was it." You know, if we could only go back before that moment, you know, be it the 1960s or you know, the Paleolithic. I think there's a spectrum of moments. There's a continuity of moments. There's a chaos of moments. There's a moment that occurs over and over again, and it's always a moment of separation. And the separation is always new in its terminology, new in its terms, but never new in its structure. And that's why the same old dragon myth, the same old myth of the dragon slayer, same myth gets trotted out again. And it's still going on. If you just pick up a newspaper and see the way, let's say the way the Arabs are depicted in our, or the Muslims in general are depicted in our society, I wouldn't be surprised if you found the term snake worshippers used at some point for, you know, they at present are the wild other that we're dealing with. In their own minds, of course, they're highly civilized people, you know. In fact, more civilized than us, but that's another matter. So let's say we want to identify some of these key points or ambiguous moments of separation when some order of intimacy is broken and replaced by an order of separation. We might, for example, go back to the Ice Age. Now, it's an interesting fact that amongst hunter-gatherer societies, which, and I should point out, by the way, for those of you who may not know, that I would say 95% of its existence as an entity, humanity has been involved in hunting and gathering as an economy. It's only the last 5% which involves pastoralism and agriculture and industry. So it's an interesting fact that amongst all the hunter-gatherer societies we can look at now, gathering is much more important than hunting. And gathering, of course, is the province of the women. Hunting is the province of the men. This is almost universal. But the hunting, as it turns out, and this is from a very nice collection of essays called Man the Hunter. It came out in 1968. I forget the editor. But it was a whole, it was interesting that it came out in 1968, because I think this whole idea of the hunter plays into the whole psychedelic movement and the rebellion of the 1960s. But the finding was that gathering is much, much, much more important economically. The hunting is prestigious. The hunting is exciting, it's adventurous. Secret societies are formed around it, rituals are formed around it, religions are formed around it. As you can see, if you look at the cave paintings in Europe, which are 99% depictions of animals. So the figures range amongst modern tribes from 10% hunting to 90% gathering amongst some African tribes, to a more even balance amongst the Eskimos. Of course, the Eskimos are up in a part of the world where hunting would obviously be much more important than gathering. And the large part of the Eskimo diet is meat, because that's what there is to eat. and I think only about 30% of Eskimo diet comes from gathering. So we could project backwards. Here's a place where ethnology could throw light on archaeology. We could project backwards to those Neanderthals as the Ice Age begins to creep up on them, the Würm glaciation, the last big Ice Age. And presumably they had some sort of gender egalitarian thing going. I like to believe this anyway. Gimbutas believes it. A lot of people believe it nowadays, that original human society, there's that word again, original human society was a gender egalitarian society. It may have been matriarchal in the strict sense of the word, that is that descent was marked through the female line because before marriage is invented, you don't know who the father is. So clearly, if you're going to have any idea of kinship at all, it has to be based on the female. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there was some kind of society of huge, strong women lording it over kind of, supernumerary men. It's much easier to see, for example, that hunting arose in prestige precisely to rectify an imbalance that would have occurred because gathering was economically so much more important, and because kinship was traced through the woman, through the female. That hunting would have been maybe, the prestige of hunting, the cult of hunting may have been a response to that imbalance. But then comes along the Ice Age, and the whole thing is thrown into a new imbalance. Now hunting, which gave itself prestige, has actually now become economically more important than gathering. And so a terrible imbalance may have occurred in Neanderthal society. In fact, that may be why they disappeared. But the same imbalance would hold true for us, too, because we, modern Homo sap Cro-Magnon types, emerge out of the Ice Age. I mean, that's where we first see ourselves, is emerging out of the ice. I think that's why that frozen fella in the Swiss Alps has been so fascinating to everybody. Everyone sees their origin in this frozen corpse. So this theory would go on to explain that therefore men in the Ice Age achieved an unfair balance of power in society. And therefore, once the ice went away, women who still remembered how to gather began to really push it as a new economy. And they began to say, aha, now we're the power. And gradually this pushing of gathering and the returning every year to sites where, say, certain wild grasses or fruits were found, and the discovery that you could reseed those areas on purpose, that this intense new activity of the women created the beginnings of agriculture, and that therefore another flip-flop now takes place in human society, and once again women are on top. And the matriarch, the famous Neolithic matriarchy, the age of the goddess, which we now know so much about, although we may not know very much accurate data about, comes into being. And Gimbutas, in her Marija Gimbutas, Gimbutas, in her book Civilisation of the Goddess, which is not only in print but remaindered, so I advise you to rush out and get it. It's got the most beautiful photographs of just about any book on the Neolithic. I mean, she photographed stuff that nobody else apparently dared to photograph because it would have screwed up their theories. Endless Neolithic goddesses of all kinds, just overwhelming evidence. It's like 95% of all the mobile art found in the Neolithic is statues of goddesses, and only less than 5% is the little phallic consort deity of the goddess, the male as consort of the goddess, and goes along with it. And therefore, so to continue with this gender war theory of human development, at the end of the Neolithic, with the introduction of a new techne, metals, which are apparently brought in from the east according to Gimbutas, by the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the Kurgan people, that is to say, most of us, the Indo-Aryans, whatever you want to call them. Brought in bronze, and this created yet another rebalancing effect on human society. And of course, since metallurgy was very, very magical, It involved digging into the body of Mother Earth in a much more intrusive way even than agriculture, and therefore has always been surrounded and is still surrounded with intense taboo, and has been largely a province of men. And so metallurgy then changes the balance once again. And now we have the image of the great patriarchalist societies of the early classical period, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians, the Marduk and Zeus worshippers, the sky god people, that big Nobo-Daddy phallus lightning bolt in the sky. And men take over, and the king replaces the queen, and now the goddess is the consort of the god, not the other way around. And the Neolithic goddess survives but gets smaller and smaller and more creepy until finally she becomes Hecate, the witch goddess, and a principle of evil, which goes right back again to the idea of Tiamat as feminine principle, as principle of water, being the evil chaotic principle, while the male principle, which is of light as opposed of day as opposed to night, light as opposed to darkness, strength as opposed to weakness, all these mythic dichotomies come into play, and we have a new propaganda in the world, the propaganda of the fathers as opposed to the propaganda of the mothers. Well, it's a very clever, neat theory, but I certainly don't think it's a categorical imperative. I'm not adopting it as dogma. For one thing, it's way oversimplified. It's like a Punch and Judy show. For another thing, there's too much actual hard data in the way of it. And for another thing, I just don't like it, you know. Even if it was true, I would reject it. However, I don't think it's useless. I don't think it's a useless theory by any means. And if I were to take Gimbutas as the major representative of this theory, I would actually bow down to this woman. Because, why? Because even though she's a professional archaeologist, she dares to have an interpretation. She actually dared to have an opinion about what things were like in prehistory, instead of just saying, well, we found 18 figurines of plump female figures, not goddesses, you know, or at least we don't know for sure. Maybe it was primitive pornography, you know, you can't be sure. That's what I call the R. Crumb theory of the Neolithic goddess, you know. At least she dared to construct a theory, and we can bounce off it, you know. We can have a conversation now. What a relief. We're no longer being stiff-armed by these academics who say, sorry, you don't have any right to interpret that because we're experts and even we don't know what it means. You know, well, I know somebody who used to work with Gimbutas, and he said that in the daytime she would be on the dig behaving just like a good scientific archaeologist, but at night she would take one of the plump female figures and go back and sit in the moonlight and listen to it. You know, so there's this lovely attack from both sides that she gives us. Not only the scientific, but the intuitive. Not only the dry academic work in the dust, which she makes very exciting, by the way, but also that nighttime intuition. You know, the realm of as Hesiod said, chaos, eros, Gaia, and old night. So that's her theory. I don't want to oversimplify. You should go read her stuff. It's not this. I'm not trying to make her into some kind of avatar of vulgar feminism here. Far from it. There are people who have used her work in that way, but that's not her fault. So that's one theory. Now we could go. We could talk about. We could talk about other theories, and I'm just going to come across them as I go along. What we're looking for always is the break, the split, the abyss that opens up in consciousness between the tribe, the old egalitarian, tribal, gender egalitarian, tribal kind of setup, which we could call a society, and the new hierarchical class-divided society in which, for the first time, there's surplus and scarcity. You know, it's a fact that the hunters may know hunger, but hunters do not know scarcity. A hunter can die of hunger, but a hunter does not die of scarcity. That scarcity and surplus, that dichotomy comes into being with agriculture. And here we come to one of my favorite books, Stone Age Economics, by Marshall Sahlins, S-A-H-L-I-N-S. Sahlins was particularly offended as an anthropologist by the nasty, brutish, and short theory of primitive man. All those words in quotes, please. And he set out to do a statistical analysis of all the field work he could gather concerning work and food gathering amongst existent hunting-gathering societies. I think he found 14 or 15 of them. And he pointed out that these are people like the Bushmen, the Pygmies, the Eskimos, who have been pushed out to the margins, to the bare margins of viability in this world. I mean, we powerful, agricultural, industrial types took all the good land, and all that's left for these folks is the tundra or the steppe or the desert or what have you. So right away you would think if anyone's leading a nasty, brutish, short life, it must be these folks. So he went and collected all the data that he could about the amount of time spent in food gathering by these people, and then he compared it to another statistical analysis that he made of primitive agriculturalist societies, slash and burn types, and found out how many hours a day they had to work. And I don't remember I may be getting the figures wrong, but it was something like this. The hunter-gatherers average 4.2 hours a day work, and that means a lot of them work even less than that. The primitive agriculturalists average 14 hours a day work. The larder, that is the number of foodstuffs known to primitive hunters, he found averaged out to about 200 different things to eat. The larder of the agricultural societies averaged out to 20 things, 1/10 of the menu for the agriculturalists. So the idea that agriculture came into being because human beings were tired of eating bugs, and it was kind of a culinary explanation of the rise of agriculture doesn't hold true. The diet of the hunter-gatherers was far more complex. It was much more of a cuisine than a mere cookery. And in fact, there's a wonderful myth, which I think a wonderful story about anthropology that Sahlins, I believe this is where I got it. He says that there was a tribe of Australian Aborigines who appear in the original literature as very nasty, brutish, and short. And the reason, the clue to this is that every year they walk over 100 miles through the desert to get to a place where there's some fallen trees and pry off the bark and eat these grubs. So any people that does that must really be desperate, right? So later on, another anthropologist went and actually deigned to ask the people themselves what they were doing. And they said something like this: well, we have nothing better to do at this time of year, and we love to go walkabout. This phrase walkabout. They just love to wander we love to wander through the desert, and we get to this place, and boy, wait till you taste those witchetty grubs. It's like as if we would say, and then I went to the Riviera and I lived on caviar for a week. And so Sahlins developed this kind of anecdotal and statistical material into a picture of Stone Age economy, the title of the book, which he was then able to coin the term the original leisure society to describe this. Actually, I don't like the word leisure anymore. It has too many negative connotations from TV land. But let's think of it as the original society of excess, of just having far more than anybody could ever want or need. And if you study, let's say, the Northwest Indians, the people up around Washington and Oregon, or what you can recover of knowledge about the Indians who lived, for example, let's say around the Chesapeake Bay, where they probably worked about, on the average, I would say about a half an hour a day on food. Work took up about a half an hour per day of the life of a people like that. Where do you think all that fantastic art came from amongst the Northwest Coast Indians? They had time, they had leisure, they had time to devote themselves to an amazing explosion or excess of creativity. And Bataille talks about this too, by the way, in The Accursed Share. He talks about how a society which experiences excess, not scarcity, but excess, will have to blow it off in some dramatic way. You know? For example, the potlatch would be the way in which the Northwest Indians blew it off. Every once in a while, some rich person would say, I hereby challenge, the whole society, I'm going to prove myself the most generous dude within, 50-mile radius. I'm going to give away everything, and hold a big party. And I just saw a wonderful show on this at the museum in Seattle. There's soup bowls the size of this, twice the size of this table, and spoons. They weren't ladles, they were spoons. For each person got one of these spoons to dish up this candlefish oil, which was a great delicacy for them. I can't imagine what it was like, but when you live in a cold climate, you get into that greasy food, And they just spent all their time doing this until we, quote, we arrived and blew the whole scene and finally actually made the potlatch illegal. Up until a few years ago, the potlatch was a crime and it had to be practiced underground. And so the whole practice of potlatch got distorted by contact with the Europeans. But originally it was an expression of social excess and just a sort of bounteous exuberance of overdoing it. And this is why so-called primitive peoples have these blowouts, when something is in season, they go where that thing is in season and they eat themselves sick and they, dance themselves ragged and they make love and they have fun. And it happens a lot, happens quite frequently. Even in the Middle Ages, there were still 111 official holidays in Europe. A third of the year off, huh? And what is that now? 12? It's down to 12 official holidays a year in this country, I think. So, I'd like to leave that as just a point that you should keep in mind as I continue to talk about the Stone Age, that we are not talking about the nasty, brutish, and short. We're talking about a great culture, which is not yet a civilization, and therefore is very hard for us to recognize as a culture. But it's a great culture. And it is a culture of permanent excess. This is my interpretation. The reason why the folks in France spent all that time decorating caves was because they were so well fed and happy that they wanted to do art all the time. I think it's an impulse that we could all recognize, or at least dream about. In, I think it was 1876, or somewhere around that date anyway, a French writer, I don't know what, I think he was actually an archaeologist, stumbled by mistake into one of the painted caves in France. This anecdote is recounted by Marshak, but I've forgotten the details. And he wrote later on in his diary, there seemed to be some daubs of colored something smeared on the wall. He couldn't see it. He could not understand that it was art. What it appeared to him as was just rubbish on the wall. This is exactly like those famous so-called primitive tribes who can't recognize a photograph when they see it. You may have heard about this. I remember these stories from my childhood, pictures of guys with bones in their noses holding a photograph upside down. It's like, they don't understand photographs. How primitive. Well, this French savant in the late 19th century could not understand that Lascaux is the greatest work of art in Europe, or at least one of them. He couldn't see it. We couldn't see it until very, very recently. The entirety of prehistory, as we now understand it, is a very recent discovery. And it began with a few sort of disgusted English and German and French gentlemen who really thought that primitive things were kind of disgusting, but they didn't have anything better to do, so they would mess around and look at these things. People like James Frazer in Folklore, The Golden Bough, who actually hated all the stuff he wrote about, or at least so he said. Thought it was evidence of Ur-Dummheit, of how stupid people were before the British came along to correct them. But nevertheless, he dabbled in it for 12 huge fucking volumes, and so beginning with those kind of people who could sort of half-see, by focusing through binoculars made out of classical literature, which of course the Greek classics contain innumerable clues about the so-called prehistorical period. They could begin to reach back. Or Bachofen, there's a wonderful example. Contemporary and friend of Nietzsche, wrote the book on mother right, invented the whole concept of matriarchy, or rather reinvented it. As far as I can make out, thought that the matriarchal period was a scandal. That it involved a lot of men who were being dominated by women and spending all their time screwing around. I mean, literally, fucking. Orgies. Culture of orgiasticism is the way he saw it. And he thought that the real Hellenes, the real Greeks, the real patriarchal people represented this great step forward in social evolution to get rid of the female, to get rid of the chthonic, to get rid of the Paleolithic, the dragon, the mothers, the water, and replace it with this a wonderful image of Greece as the epitome of reason and bare white stones. We forget that those temples were painted like Hindu temples, and that the statues were painted like the statues in Hindu temples, and that even these great Hellenes who were so patriarchal and masculine and Platonic and everything themselves were far closer to what we would consider wild-ass paganism, than we can ever imagine. So Bachofen, burrowing back through that wild-ass paganism, recovered the matriarchy, and he thought it was awful. He was shocked. Actually, I think he had mixed feelings. Sometimes he kind of liked it. How can you dislike the orgy after all? I mean, it's just... But he couldn't admit it. It would have been, pas comme il faut in the Victorian era to actually admit to a nostalgia for this matriarchal orgiasticism. And his work was taken up has been taken up and reinterpreted by some smart feminist students of prehistory, including Gimbutas. So, I would like to shift the focus of the question now and question the origin of the state. We've talked about how for millions and millions of years human beings live in a state of egalitarian surplus economy. Hunting and gathering goes on for millions after millions of years, and no one ever thinks to change it. This, of course, from the point of view of progress and evolution, looks like degeneracy. However, from the point of view of, from the sort of postmodern point of view, which views civilization as a mixed blessing at best, this Paleolithic past begins to look more and more like the Golden Age, begins to look like a very good thing. Now, politically, the kind of tribal structure that we're talking about is not and cannot be considered as the state. And in fact, anthropologists and archaeologists no longer consider that there was in those days such a thing as the state. Society? Yes, of course there was society. Human society itself begins with that original moment of splitting apart, which immediately then demands its antithesis in a coming together. So I think if you want to ask the origins of human society, it is also in that mythical moment of falling apart, of the split, the primordial split of consciousness. But the state is something that comes much later. Only a few minutes ago, really. And it arose in the as in the form that we know it now, pretty much in the Neolithic, I think in the late Neolithic. And if you look at a place like Çatalhöyük, which is a town, a small, it's in fact the first city in the world, as far as we know. It's in Anatolia, Turkey, and it was dug up, I think, in the late 50s or early 60s, and has still not been paid very close attention to. And it turned out to be a town with streets laid out in a grid pattern, like New York. It's a C with a cedilla sign underneath, Catalhuyuk. And I think, what's the name of the guy who worked on that? Mellart? Anybody know? James Mellart? Yeah. Mellart, I think. So, all right, now we're faced with another mystery. First of all, we had the mystery of gender, then we had the mystery of agriculture. Why would anybody want to give up hunting and gathering for such a shitty deal as agriculture? And now we have to ask ourselves about the state. Why would anybody give up egalitarian society, which persisted well into the Neolithic, according to Gimbutas, and I'm perfectly willing to believe her, a society which, moreover, has revealed almost no signs of warfare or violence as we understand it. There's no human sacrifice to be found in the Paleolithic and early Neolithic, no evidence of cannibalism, or some people think there is, but I disagree. I have a different interpretation of all of that material. And warfare begins with the Bronze Age and eventually, and seems to coincide with the invention of the state as a means of organizing society. Now, what earthly reason could there have been to give up what I call 1,000,000 years of anarchy in favor of this tight-assed form of order, in which a few people, of course, are in a much better position than ever, the kings and priests, but most of us are beginning that long history of work, consume, die. Why? You know, what was in it for us, for Christ's sake? Why should we have ever adopted agriculture? Why should we have ever adopted the state? All the old evolutionist views that these were steps forward, that agriculture would, of course, provide more food and better food, and that the state would protect people against violence. Well, what violence? You know, but don't ask. There's violence out there in the forest. I can feel it. You know. Why? Who? Where did this? Was this a scam? Are we going to have how about the conspiratorial theory of history? You know, an elite which bands together to enslave the rest of humanity, and constructs out of nothingness a new religion based on the idea that you are nothing but a piece of dead flesh cut off from the primordial dragon, and that it is your duty to do nothing but slave for the priest and the king, and to fill up that storehouse with grain, to make that surplus on the one hand and that scarcity on the other. You are in the scarcity. King is in the surplus. You know? What caused this? What on earth could have caused this? The French anthropologist Pierre Clastres, Clastres, has two books which are very germane to this question. One is called Society Against the State, and that one, I don't know whether it's in print or not, but you should certainly seek it out. It's a masterpiece. And the other one, which just came out recently, and I'm proud to say the publishing company that I'm associated with, Autonomedia, got to publish the English version of the book that Clastres was working on when he unfortunately died and didn't finish, called The Archaeology of Violence. In these two books, Clastres puts forward a theory that society itself is a structure which is meant to resist the emergence of the state. It's not just that people were, you know, happily going along, bumbling along through the whole Paleolithic, and they never thought of it. You know, they never thought, oh, you know, we could enslave all these people and make them work for us. The thought occurred countless times to countless sons of bitches throughout the entire, I mean, it probably occurred to the second Australopithecine, you know, that he could enslave the first and make him work for him. I mean, it's a very old idea, but it never worked. And Clastres doesn't give this, by the way, this fantasy about the past. He sticks strictly to his field work amongst the Guarani Indians of South America. But I'm extrapolating. I'm making the extrapolation. Later on in his work on primitive war, he did begin to extrapolate back into the past. And I'll get to that in a minute. So Clastres sees society itself as a defense against these sons of bitches who come along from time to time and try to invent the state. Everybody knows this happens. You can find stories about it in the mythology. You can work in comparative mythology and separate this out as an actual motif in folklore. We've always known that these potential kings and priests were around, but we've resisted them, apparently. And Clastres looks at the tribal societies he studies, and he sees many of the social institutions in a new light because of this theory. And so he rejects Levi Strauss and all the earlier work, which he is in part based on, and comes to a new theory about primitive society, that it is in fact a kind of freedom machine, if I can put it that way. That's my phrase, not his. It's an actual mechanism for the preservation of social freedoms. And that these things are very well understood, at least on the level of folklore or mythology, by the societies in common. And then in his second book, which, as I say, he unfortunately never finished, called The Archaeology of Violence, he began to develop this theory. He began to focus in on the question of warfare. Now, Gimbutas points out that there's very little evidence of warfare all the way up through the Neolithic. There's no fortified settlements. There are no huge caches of weapons. There are very, very few examples of skeletons you can find that seem to have been the victims of violence or murder. And if you look at so-called primitive tribes, you find the same thing. There's very little evidence for organized, continual violence that we call warfare amongst so-called primitive people. In fact, the last surviving example of this, I think, might be the wonderful Yanomami, of the wildest, the wildest tribe, wildest ass tribe in the world, I think, and they have just continually resisted the onslaught of civilization, and they do it because they're like, if you took the Hell's Angels and dropped them in the middle of the jungle and came back 5,000 years later, that would be these people. They're really wonderful. I really admire them, and they're completely given over to violence. It's their entire way of life revolves around violence. They have these on the slightest excuse, they take these clubs out and start bashing each other over the head. There's a wonderful ethnographic film. Apparently, Stephen Taylor saw it. I haven't seen it. Of some anthros who were fortunate enough to be in the village on the day one of these fights broke out, and you know, with their jaws hanging to their knees, filmed this going on. Incredible violence. And the first anthropologist who really studied them, Napoleon Chagnon, had one of the classic anecdotes of modern anthropology. He went to, as a young anthropologist, he went to study these people, and they just gave him shit continually. They laughed at him. They wouldn't answer his questions. They stole his food right in front of his face. They pushed him around. They made fun of him constantly, and he was the saddest little anthropologist in the world. You know, he saw his whole career going up in smoke from these sons of bitches who won't pay attention. You know. And one day, at the lowest point of his depression, he's sitting in his hut. He has one can of sardines left. And the lowest guy on the pecking order in the tribe, some cripple who everybody else laughs at, comes into his tent, kicks him out of the way, and steals his last can of sardines. It's the last straw, you know, and he loses it. And he rushes after this guy, and in front of the whole tribe, he starts pounding on him. Give me back my fucking sardines, you son of a bitch. And after that, the elders of the tribe come up to him and say, gee, you know, sorry, man, we didn't know you were human. Now, warfare amongst these people is clearly not a force for centripetality, you know, for moving in towards the center and towards ever more severe forms of social order. Warfare amongst folks like this is centrifugal. It just scatters every social force to the winds. It dissipates. It's a form of excess. It's a form of working off that excess of Stone Age economy, this time in the form of violence. And of course it involves the expenditure of great amounts of wealth to do this. You have to raise up a troop of your friends, and you go and you have this adventure, and you have to leave your fields behind. You can't do any hunting. I mean, by their standards, it's very expensive. So it's a form of waste. They waste the excess in this means through primitive warfare. And right up until very recently, the examples of the pictures of war that we get from, let's say, even the Plains Indians of the 19th century, it's still very much this way. It's not a warfare which is aimed towards the creation of a state. In other words, towards the conquering and enslaving of an entire people. It's a dissipative warfare. It spreads itself out in every direction, and it's really actually not that violent. One of the big problems that the Plains Indians tribes faced when they first came in contact with the Europeans was that counting coup was considered to be far groovier thing to do than killing somebody. If you could take your coup stick, which was a symbolic weapon, it couldn't be used to hurt a fly really, and get close to one of the enemy on your pony and touch him, and in sight of everybody you touched him, and then get away and leave the guy alive, but his face is completely gone. He's been touched. And counting coup was far more sophisticated and really cool way for the warrior to act than to actually kill somebody, which is really messy and kind of crude, you know. So, but unfortunately, the Europeans didn't understand this, and even after they were touched with the coup stick, they would just go right on firing with that damn fire stick, you know, and wiping out the warriors who had done the really brave thing, who had counted coup. So this is primitive warfare. It is not, repeat, underline, not war as civilization knows war. According to Clastres, if I read him correct, because the essay breaks off at the point that he died, and he promised that he was going to go on and analyze what could cause these social structures to break down and give way to the state. He was actually going to try to answer the question of the origin of the state. And I think he was going to find that origin in a breakdown of the primitive warfare structure, in that there would come a point at which, inadvertently almost, primitive warfare would result in the conquest and enslavement of another tribe, and therefore the creation of a class structure. And in order to manage that class structure, the state would have to arise. So that's actually, again, it's really not explanatory, because why did that accident occur? Nevertheless, it's very close to being an explanation, and it's a very interesting concept. So now we have the state. We have social hierarchy, we have property, because also the ideas of personal by the way, how am I doing for time? What time is it? I have 5 minutes? All right, well, so I will just arbitrarily break off here, because I want to leave some time for questions. I didn't realize it was so late. Someone has to get the hook out for me, you know, and, okay. So wait a minute, let me just remember where we are here. I got about 2/5 done of my first lecture here. No, it's okay. But at this point, let's leave it at that, the mystery of the arising of the state. And next time, I actually hope to focus in on an example of a fascinating example, which again has to do with my studies in Wisconsin last summer, of a society which apparently moved backwards through this supposed developmental system, who were at one time agriculturalists, but who gave it up to go back into the woods and become hunters and gatherers again. And what role psychedelics played in that story, and what role economics played in that story, what role art played, and so forth and so on. I will have to rush through the rest of my introductory material in order to get into this fascinating example of a hunter-gatherer society which created some of the most beautiful art in America, the effigy mounds of Wisconsin. So, if there are questions, I will certainly be happy to entertain them. Yeah?
was wondering if you thought the fall myth in the Bible, that perhaps the forbidden fruit was really like psychedelic mushrooms.
Yeah, that's a very prominent theory, of course. The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which actually creates consciousness, self-consciousness, as Genesis points out. And they knew that they were naked. In other words, they knew that previously they had not been clothed with the constructs which are rational thought, which are self-consciousness, and so forth and so on. So that many people, including Gordon Wasson, W-A-S-S-O-N, very important thinker for everything I'm saying here, especially on the psychedelic theory, I think it was he who first proposed that the apple was in fact a magic mushroom. And that theory was taken up by John Allegro in his book The Mushroom and the Cross, which has been completely trashed by everybody as totally insane, but I happen to think it's a really great book, in which he traces the mushroom lore amongst the Semitic peoples, ending up with the Bible, and identifies Jesus as a mushroom in the end. I can't even hear you, Tom. You have to...
How do you think the Sufi myth of the birds relates to all of this?
In what sense?
To the generation of culture and consciousness and peoples and the way they're living. Or do you see that?
I'm sorry. I haven't thought about it, and nothing springs to mind. I'll think about it and get back to you.
You know, some of the stuff you were saying about the myth of the primitive people not being able to see photographs, a lot of that has to do with, Robert Flaherty's quote-unquote Nanuka, the North's inability to see motion pictures, and it had nothing to do with his intellect. It had to do with he hadn't learned how to see that kind of light, and his eyes were adjusted to a different kind of color spectrum, living in the white north, quote unquote.
Yeah. I mean, there are always reasons for the failure of perception. What's interesting to me is that these failures are universal, and they cannot be imputed to primitive peoples. In fact, as I said, I believe that the sensorium of prehistoric humanity was much, much larger than that of at least early agriculture. And even with all the explosion of information and endless information that we think of as a great complexity, it may still be far simpler and more impoverished than the sensorial world of say, the Neanderthals.
Yeah,
so the only point that I was trying to make is I wasn't trying to explain how these failures of perception occur. That's an interesting study in perceptual brain processes. What I was interested in was to make an arbitrary separation between brain and mind, and point out that the mind of modern Europe is also thoroughly riddled with such failures of perception.
Yeah, Oliver Sacks just wrote a big, gigantic essay about these people whose sight was restored at 50 years old for the first time in their life, and their complete inability to process information in the way that people that have learned to see can.
Yeah. The whole development of the third dimension in art only occurs in the Renaissance, and is in fact completely artificial. It relates to our natural perceptions in only the most tangential ways. But since the Renaissance, we've been trained to see in 3 dimensions, and we've been trained to think that art which does not include these 3 dimensions is primitive art. And there are still art historians who will tell you that Islamic art never developed the 3rd dimension, and therefore it's just merely decorative art. Or the painters of the cave painters of the Paleolithic never developed the 3rd dimension, as if the perception of the 3rd dimension was some proof of evolutionary superiority. It isn't. It's just a different way of doing art, that's all.